She rescued a broken stray wolf. 3 days later, the Alpha King claimed she was his fated mate. A true life story. Nora Vance had a rule: never stop on a dark road at night. She had made this rule herself, 3 years ago, after a shift at the hospital that had gone on far too long. She was a nurse. She worked in the emergency room of a small hospital just outside town, and she had seen enough bad things happen on dark roads to know better than to become part of one of those stories herself. But rules are easy to make in daylight. They are much harder to keep at 1 in the morning, when your eyes are heavy, your body still smells like the hospital, and something moves in the ditch beside the road. To understand why she broke her own rule that night, you have to understand a little about who Nora Vance was. She had grown up in a house full of animals, a mother who could not walk past a stray cat without bringing it home, a father who once spent an entire weekend building a ramp so their old dog could still climb onto the porch after his hips gave out. Kindness, in that house, was never treated as something extra. It was simply what you did, the same as brushing your teeth or locking the door at night. She carried that habit with her into adulthood, even after life gave her plenty of reasons to be more careful. She remembered, especially, one night early in her nursing career, when a woman had come into the emergency room after stopping to help a stranger whose car had broken down on the highway. The stranger had turned out to be dangerous. The woman had been badly hurt. Nora had been the one to hold her hand while they waited for surgery, and she had never forgotten the woman's last words to her before she was wheeled away. "I still don't regret stopping. I just wish I'd been more careful about how." That night had taught Nora 2 things at once, and she had carried both of them ever since, tangled together in a way that never fully resolved. The first was that the world could be cruel to people who tried to do good in it. The second was that she still wanted to be the kind of person who stopped anyway, only smarter about it. So she had made her rule about dark roads, not because she wanted to stop caring, but because she wanted to survive long enough to keep caring for a long time. She almost drove past the wolf that night. She told herself later that she almost drove past it, the way people tell themselves things to feel better about choices that changed their whole life. But the truth is, the moment her headlights swept over that shape in the grass, she was already slowing the car down. Her foot found the brake before her mind had decided anything. At first, she thought it was a dog, a big dog, maybe a German shepherd that had gotten loose and been hit by a car. She had seen that before too. But as she stepped out of her car, leaving the engine running, and the headlights pointed toward the ditch, she realized this was no dog. It was a wolf, a real wolf, lying on its side in wet grass, one back leg bent at a wrong angle, its gray fur matted with mud and something darker that she did not want to name. Its ribs moved in short, shallow breaths, and its eyes, when it lifted its head just slightly to look at her, were a strange, deep gold, almost like they were lit from somewhere behind them. Nora stood very still. She knew the rules. Wild animals, especially injured ones, could be dangerous. A frightened, hurting wolf could snap at anything that came near, even someone trying to help. She had learned this in her wildlife rescue training years ago, back when she used to spend her weekends volunteering at a small animal shelter before nursing school took over her whole life. But something about the way this wolf looked at her made her forget the rules for a moment. It did not growl. It did not try to pull itself away from her. It just watched her, breathing hard, like it was waiting to see what she would do. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to the wolf. "Okay, let's see what we're dealing with here." She walked back to her car and pulled out the old wool blanket she kept in the trunk for emergencies. Her hands were shaking a little as she approached the wolf again, slow and low, the way she would approach any frightened animal. She talked to it the whole time, soft nonsense words, the kind you use on scared children and scared animals, because the words themselves don't matter as much as the sound of a calm voice. The wolf let her wrap the blanket around it. It let her lift it, as gently as she could, and carry it to the back seat of her car. It was heavy, much heavier than she expected, and by the time she had it settled, her arms were shaking from the effort. But the wolf never bit her, never even snapped at her. It just lay there, watching her with those gold eyes, breathing hard. She drove home faster than she should have. Nora lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, the kind of house with a big yard and an old garage that she had slowly turned into a place for helping injured animals. It had started small, a hurt bird here, a stray cat there, but over the years it had grown into something like a small hobby rescue center. She had bandages, splints, medicine, even a heat lamp. She was not a vet, but she had learned enough over the years, and she had a phone number for an emergency vet who owed her a favor or two. She called him the moment she got the wolf into the garage. "You found a what?" the vet said, his voice thick with sleep. "A wolf," Nora said again. "Hit by something, I think. Maybe a car, maybe something else. His back leg is broken, and he's got cuts on his side that don't look like they came from a fall." There was a pause on the line. "Wolves don't usually come this close to town." "I know," Nora said, "but he's here now, and he needs help." The vet talked her through what he could over the phone: how to check for shock, how to keep the wolf warm, how to clean the wounds without making them worse. He promised to come by first thing in the morning, since driving out at 1 in the morning for a wild wolf was, in his words, a little more excitement than my knees can handle tonight. So Nora did what she always did. She got to work. She spent the rest of that night on the floor of her garage, cleaning wounds by lamplight, wrapping the wolf's leg as best she could with what she had, and talking to him the whole time in that same soft voice. He watched her hands as she worked. He never once tried to bite her, even when she knew she must be causing him pain. There were moments when his whole body went stiff and his breath caught, and she would pause and press her palm gently against his chest, the way she did with frightened patience, until he settled again. By 4 in the morning, she was covered in dirt and dried blood, and utterly exhausted, but the wolf was breathing steadier. His leg was splinted as well as she could manage. The worst of his wounds were cleaned and covered. She sat back against the garage wall and looked at him. "You're a strange one," she said quietly. "Most animals I bring in here are trying to get away from me by now." The wolf simply looked at her, his gold eyes heavy with exhaustion, and let out a long breath through his nose. It almost sounded like a sigh. She must have fallen asleep sitting up, because the next thing she knew, sunlight was coming through the garage window and her neck ached from the angle she'd slept in. The wolf was still there, still lying where she had left him, but his eyes were open and watching her. "Morning," she mumbled, rubbing her neck. "You look like you slept better than I did." The vet arrived an hour later, and after a long, careful examination, he confirmed what Nora already suspected: 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, the broken leg, and the strange wounds along his side, which the vet studied for a long moment with his brow furrowed. "These aren't from a car," he said finally. "What are they from, then?" The vet did not answer right away. He looked at the wounds again, then at the wolf's face, then back at Nora. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never seen marks quite like this. Almost looks deliberate, like something did this on purpose." Nora felt a small chill move through her, even though the garage was warm with morning sun. "Deliberate how?" "I couldn't tell you," the vet said, "but whatever did this to him, I'd guess he's lucky to be alive." The vet gave her medicine, showed her how to reset the shoulder properly, and told her the leg would need at least 3 weeks to heal if it healed at all. Wild animals, he warned her, often did not survive injuries like this, even with the best care. The stress alone could kill them. But something told Nora this one was different. She could not explain it, not even to herself. There was something in the way he watched her, something almost too aware, too patient, that did not feel like an ordinary wild animal at all. She decided to keep him in the garage rather than call animal control, which she knew she was probably not supposed to do. Technically, injured wild wolves were meant to be reported and handed over to state wildlife services. But something about this particular wolf made her want to keep him close, to see this through herself. She told herself it was because she did not trust the system to actually help him, that he might end up somewhere worse. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she felt somehow responsible for him, like he had chosen her, out there on that dark road, and it would be wrong to hand him off to strangers now. The first full day passed slowly. She changed his bandages, brought him water, sat with him for long stretches, even though she should have been sleeping after her overnight shift. He ate almost nothing that first day, which worried her, but he drank water eagerly whenever she offered it, lapping it from a bowl she held steady for him. By the second day, something had shifted. He was more alert, his eyes tracking her every movement around the garage. When she came in that morning, he lifted his head and made a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, more like a greeting. She found herself smiling at the sound, ridiculous as that felt. "Good morning to you too," she said. She had started talking to him constantly by then, the way people talk to pets, telling him about her day, her tired feet, the annoying coworker at the hospital who never restocked the supply closet properly. He listened, or at least he seemed to, his ears turning toward her voice, his gold eyes following her face. It was on the second night that something strange happened, something she would think about for a long time afterward. She had fallen asleep in the old armchair she had dragged into the garage, meaning only to rest her eyes for a moment. She woke suddenly some hours later, to find the wolf had somehow pulled himself closer to her chair, despite his splinted leg, despite how much that must have hurt him. He was lying with his head near her feet, and when she looked down at him in the dim light, his eyes were open, watching her. "You should be resting," she whispered. He simply stared back at her, unblinking, and for one strange, unshakable moment, Nora had the distinct feeling that he understood every word she said. She told herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. She went back to sleep, but some part of her did not fully believe her own explanation, not even then. By the third day the wolf was stronger. He could shift his weight without wincing quite as badly. He had begun eating small amounts of the raw meat she brought him, though he always waited for her to sit down nearby before he would touch it, as if he did not want to eat alone, or perhaps as if he wanted her close while he did. She had taken that day off from her hospital shift, using one of the sick days she had been saving, and spent most of the morning in the garage with him, reading a book with one hand and resting the other against his side, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. It was just past 6 in the morning on the fourth day when someone knocked on her front door. Nora froze. It was far too early for visitors, and she was not expecting anyone. She glanced toward the garage, where the wolf lay resting, and felt an odd, protective instinct rise up in her chest, sharp and sudden. She went to the front door anyway, peering through the small window beside it before opening it. A man stood on her porch. He was tall, taller than most men she had met, with dark hair that looked like he had run his hands through it too many times, and a jaw that seemed set with tension even in the pale morning light. He wore a plain dark jacket, simple clothes, nothing that stood out, and yet there was something about the way he stood that made her think of the wolf in her garage. That same stillness, that same sense of something powerful being carefully held back. His eyes found hers through the glass before she had even fully opened the door, and something about that gaze made the back of her neck prickle. She opened the door only partway, keeping the chain latched. "Can I help you?" "My name is Cade," the man said. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost like exhaustion, or maybe fear held very tightly in check. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Nora's stomach tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "A wolf," Cade said. "Gray coat, gold eyes, injured 3 days ago along Route 9. His eyes did not leave hers. You brought him home. You've been caring for him." Nora felt her pulse quicken, a mix of fear and something else she could not quite name. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've been searching for him for 3 days, Cade said, and for the first time, his careful control slipped just slightly, and she saw something raw underneath it. Worry, real worry, the kind she recognized from families in the hospital waiting room. "He's my brother." Nora blinked. "Your brother is a wolf?" Cade's jaw tightened. "It's a long story, one I would rather explain inside than on your porch, if you'll let me." Every instinct Nora had built up over years of living carefully, of following rules about dark roads and strangers at the door, told her to say no, to shut the door, lock it, and call someone. But there was the wolf in her garage, who had let her hold him, clean his wounds, sit beside him through the night, And there was this man in front of her, who spoke about him with a kind of pain that did not sound like a lie. She thought about the strange wounds the vet could not explain. She thought about the way the wolf watched her, like he understood every word. Slowly, she unlatched the chain. "You have 5 minutes," she said, "and if you try anything, I have a very large kitchen knife, and I am not afraid to use it." Something flickered across Cade's face that might have been the start of a smile, quickly suppressed. Understood. She led him through the house, toward the garage, watching him closely the whole way. He walked carefully, deliberately, like a man trying very hard not to seem like a threat. When they reached the garage door, she paused with her hand on the handle. "Before I open this," she said, "you're going to tell me what's actually going on, because none of this makes sense, and I want an explanation before I let you anywhere near him." Cade nodded slowly. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding something, and then he said, "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. I need you to listen to all of it before you decide I'm insane." "I'm a nurse," Nora said. "I've heard a lot of impossible things at 3 in the morning. Try me." So he told her. He told her about his family, a family that went back many generations, further than any normal family tree could explain. He told her about an old bloodline, one that carried something in it that most people would call myth, the ability to change, to become something other than human, something older and wilder. He told her they were not the only ones, that there were others like them, scattered in small hidden communities, keeping to themselves, keeping the truth of what they were carefully guarded from a world that would not understand it, or worse, would not let them live in peace if the truth ever got out. He told her that his family led one such community, not far from the very road where she had found the wolf, that his people called their leader something like a king, an old word from a language that predated most modern languages, though in practice it simply meant the one responsible for keeping everyone safe. He told her that 3 days ago, a rival group, one that had long resented his family's position, had attacked his younger brother while he was out alone, hoping to weaken the family, to send a message, that his brother had barely escaped, badly hurt, and had vanished before anyone could reach him. "We searched for 3 days, Cade said, his voice tightening at the memory. "We thought we had lost him, and then this morning, one of our trackers found traces near this house. His scent, fading, but here." Nora stared at him, trying to process everything he had said. It should have sounded insane. It should have made her want to laugh, or call the police, or both. But she thought of the wolf's strange gold eyes. She thought of the wounds the vet could not explain, patterned, deliberate. She thought of the way the wolf seemed to understand her, every single time she spoke. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the wolf in my garage is actually your brother, a person, who turns into a wolf." "Yes, and that he was attacked by some kind of rival group." "Yes, and you're some kind of—" She searched for the word, feeling faintly ridiculous even saying it aloud. "King." Cade's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "It sounds strange when you say it like that. It sounds strange no matter how you say it," Nora said. But even as she said it, some deep, quiet part of her mind was already accepting it. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was 3 days of watching a wolf's gold eyes follow her every move, like he understood far more than any ordinary animal should. Whatever the reason, she found she believed him. She opened the garage door. The wolf's head lifted immediately at the sound, his ears pinning forward, and the moment his gold eyes landed on Cade, something in his whole body changed. He let out a sound Nora had never heard from him before, somewhere between a whine and a bark, and tried to push himself up despite his splinted leg. "Easy," Cade said, moving past Nora quickly, dropping to his knees beside the wolf. "Easy, Fen. I'm here. I found you." The wolf, Fen apparently, pressed his head against Cade's chest, and Cade wrapped his arms around him, holding him carefully, mindful of his injuries, but holding him tightly all the same. Nora stood back near the door, watching the reunion with a strange lump forming in her throat. She had not expected it to feel this real, this raw. Whatever these two men were, brothers or wolves or something else entirely, The love between them was not something that could be faked. "You did this," Cade said after a long moment, looking up at her over his brother's head, his eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to tears. "You kept him alive." "I did what anyone would have done," Nora said, though her voice came out quieter than she meant it to. "No," Cade said, shaking his head slowly. "You didn't. Most people would have driven past. Most people would have been too afraid, or called animal control, or simply not stopped at all on a dark road at 1 in the morning. You stopped. You brought a wild, wounded wolf into your home and spent 3 days keeping him alive, with nothing but a phone call to a vet and your own 2 hands." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is not what anyone would have done. That is something else." Nora did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. Fenn, for his part, seemed to have decided he liked her rather a lot. Over the next several days, as Cade visited regularly to check on his brother's recovery, Fenn would nudge his head against Nora's hand whenever she came near, or press his weight gently against her leg when she sat beside him, in a way that reminded her strongly of an oversized, overly affectionate dog, rather than the powerful, ancient creature Cade had described. It made her laugh, more than once, the sight of this supposedly fearsome wolf acting like an overgrown puppy whenever she scratched behind his ears. "He likes you," Cade said one afternoon, watching this display with something unreadable in his expression. "He likes anyone who feeds him," Nora said, though she could not fully hide her own smile. "No," Cade said quietly, "it's more than that. He's usually very cautious around strangers, especially now, after what happened to him." He paused, watching his brother lean happily into Nora's hand. "He trusts you completely. That doesn't happen easily, not with our kind." Nora glanced up at him, something in his tone catching her attention. "What do you mean, your kind?" Cade hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Finally he said, "There's something in our tradition. A kind of recognition, passed down through every generation of our family as far back as anyone can remember. Sometimes, when someone outside our world does something extraordinary for one of us, something that costs them, something that comes from pure will rather than obligation, it creates a bond. We call it many things, but the closest translation into your language would be something like fated. A person who is recognized this way becomes tied to our family in a way that cannot easily be undone." Nora felt her stomach do something strange, somewhere between a drop and a flip. "You're telling me this because 3 days ago," Cade said, his voice steady but quiet, "my brother came to you in the worst state of his life, half dead in a ditch, and you did not run. You did not call animal control. You spent 3 sleepless nights keeping him alive, at real cost to yourself, expecting nothing in return." He met her eyes fully now. "In our tradition, that is exactly what marks someone as fated." Nora's mouth went dry. "Fated to what?" Cade did not look away. "Fated mate," he said simply. "To me." For a long moment, the garage was completely silent, except for the soft sound of Fenn's tail thumping against the floor, entirely unbothered by the tension in the air. "That's—" Nora started, then stopped, then started again. "That's a lot to put on someone. I found a wolf in a ditch. I didn't sign up to be anyone's fated anything." "I know," Cade said, and to her surprise, he did not push, did not argue, did not try to convince her of anything further. "I'm not asking you to believe it, or accept it, or do anything at all right now. I only felt you deserved to know the truth of what you've stepped into, rather than being kept in the dark about it while I figured out how to explain things to you slowly, the way I probably should have." "That's surprisingly reasonable of you," Nora said, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly despite herself. "I've had a lot of time to think about how to say all this," Cade admitted, and for the first time, she saw something almost like nervousness cross his features. "None of the ways I practiced sounded any less strange than the way I just said it." After he left that day, Nora sat alone in her garage for a long time, Fenn's head resting heavy and warm across her lap, and tried to make sense of what had just happened to her life. She was not the type of person who made big decisions quickly. She liked lists, careful thinking, time to sit with a problem before deciding anything. But this was not the kind of problem that fit neatly onto a list. She called her mother that evening, mostly because she did not know who else to call, and because her mother had a way of cutting through confusion that Nora had relied on her whole life. She did not tell her mother everything, of course. She could not explain wolves and kings and bloodlines over the phone without sounding like she needed to see someone professionally. Instead, she said only that she had met someone serious, someone with a complicated family and a complicated life, and that he had said something to her that had scared her a little, something about this being more than just a normal relationship. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Does he make you feel safe, or does he make you feel small? Safe, Nora said, without having to think about it. He makes me feel safe. Then what exactly are you scared of? Nora did not have a clean answer for that. She thought about the ditch on Route 9, the gold eyes, the weeks of quiet mornings in the garage, the way Cade had looked at her like she had done something enormous, simply by refusing to drive past a hurting creature. I think I'm scared that it's real, she admitted finally. It would be easier if it wasn't. Her mother laughed softly on the other end of the line. Nothing easy is ever worth keeping, sweetheart. You didn't raise yourself on easy things. You've never once in your life driven past something that needed you. Why would you start now, just because this time it might need all of you, instead of just an evening? Nora sat with that long after the call ended, Fenn's steady breathing the only sound in the quiet garage, and slowly, the tight knot of fear in her chest began to loosen, just a little. Despite everything, despite the impossible things he had told her over the past week, despite the fact that her entire understanding of the world had been quietly turned upside down, Nora found herself almost laughing. No, I don't think there was a smooth way to tell someone they're fated to be the mate of a secret wolf king. No, Cade agreed. There really isn't. Over the following weeks, Nora's life did not simply return to normal, but it did not explode into chaos either. It settled, slowly, into something new. Fenn's leg healed steadily under her care, and eventually the day came when he could stand on all four legs without wincing, then walk, then finally run in wide circles around her backyard, with something like pure joy, his gold eyes bright with the simple pleasure of movement after weeks of stillness. Nora stood on her back porch that day and cried without entirely understanding why, watching him run free again. Cade visited often during those weeks, always careful, always patient, never pushing her toward anything she was not ready for. They talked, mostly, about her work at the hospital, the strange and difficult things she saw there, about his responsibilities leading his community, the weight of decisions that affected so many lives beyond his own, about small, ordinary things too, books they had both read, foods they both liked, the particular kind of exhaustion that came from caring deeply about people who depended on you. She learned that being what his people called a king was less about power and more about responsibility, a constant weight of decisions that could mean the difference between safety and disaster for everyone under his care. She began to understand why he had seemed so worn down and careful the first morning she met him, not because he was dangerous, but because he was tired, in the particular way that people are tired when they carry more than their share of worry for others. She learned, too, about the rival group Cade had mentioned that first morning, the ones responsible for Fenn's injuries. They called themselves something that translated roughly to the Hollow, a splinter group that had broken away from Cade's community years earlier over a dispute about leadership and had grown increasingly bitter and aggressive since. They believed Cade's family held power that should belong to them, and they had grown bold enough recently to attack members of his family directly, something that had never happened in his father's time as leader. "Are you in danger?" Nora asked one evening, watching him more closely than she meant to. "Always a little," Cade admitted. "It comes with the position, but we're careful. We have people watching for trouble, and the Hollow are not strong enough yet to move against us directly. What happened to Fenn was cowardly, an ambush against someone alone and unprepared. It won't happen again, not if I can help it." "That's not exactly reassuring," Nora said. "No," Cade agreed, "but it's the truth, and I promised myself I wouldn't lie to you, even about the difficult parts. Later, she learned more of the history behind it, pieced together slowly over several long evenings when Cade seemed to need to talk as much as she needed to understand. His father had led their community for almost 30 years before him, a steady, careful man who had kept the peace, mostly through patience and quiet strength rather than force. The Hollow had broken away during his father's time, a group of families who believed leadership should be decided by strength alone rather than by the old bloodlines, and who had grown more bitter with each year that passed, without gaining the influence they wanted. For a long time, the split had been mostly quiet, more a cold distance than an open conflict. Families on both sides mostly kept to themselves, avoided each other at the shared gathering places, spoke of old grievances only in hushed voices among their own. But something had changed in the last year, Cade explained. A new voice among the Hollow's leadership pushing for something bolder, something that had frightened even some of the Hollow's own people. The attack on Finn had been the first real act of violence in over a decade, and it had shaken Cade badly, not only because of the danger to his brother, but because of what it signaled about what might come next. "My father used to tell me that peace is not something you win once and keep forever," Cade said, staring into the middle distance one evening as they sat together on the back steps of the old house. "It's something you have to keep choosing, every single day, sometimes even when the other side has stopped choosing it with you." "That sounds exhausting," Nora said. "It is," Cade admitted, "but the alternative is worse. My father chose peace, even when it cost him things he wanted. I'm trying to do the same." Nora reached over and took his hand, saying nothing, because sometimes there was nothing useful to say, only something useful to do, which was simply to stay close and let him know he was not carrying all of it alone. There was a night, some weeks into this strange new arrangement, when the danger Cade had spoken of stopped being an abstract thing and became very real. Nora had stayed late at Cade's family home, a large old house set back from the road, surrounded by dense trees, that served as something like the heart of his community. She had come to know several of the people there by then, Fenn, of course, who had fully recovered and treated her like a beloved older sister, always underfoot, always eager for attention. There was also a woman named Dee, sharp-tongued and quick to laugh, who had become something like a friend to Nora over the past weeks, teasing her mercilessly about the way Cade's whole demeanor softened whenever Nora walked into a room. Earlier that same evening, before everything changed, Nora and Dee had been sitting on the porch shelling peas from the garden into a big metal bowl, a task Dee insisted was more relaxing than it looked. "You're different than the others he's brought around," Dee said, not looking up from her work. "There've been others?" Nora asked, more curious than jealous. Dee snorted. "Not really. A few dinners, years ago, before he took over from his father. Nothing that lasted more than a season. He always seemed like a man waiting for something, though nobody could say what." She glanced sideways at Nora. "Fenn knew before any of us did. You know, the day he came home limping and half-starved, all he would say was that a woman with tired eyes and steady hands had saved his life. He said it like it explained everything, like we should already understand." "I just did what anyone would do," Nora said, the words familiar in her mouth by now. "You keep saying that," Dee said, finally looking up, her expression softer than her usual teasing. "But you weren't just anyone. You were the one who stopped. That matters more than you're willing to give yourself credit for." She tossed a pea pod into the bowl with more force than necessary. "For what it's worth, I like you, and I don't like most people Cade brings around, so consider that a rare honor." Nora had laughed at that, warmth spreading through her chest, and for a moment, sitting on that porch in the fading evening light, everything had felt simple and good, the way ordinary evenings with friends are supposed to feel. It was past midnight, only a few hours later, when the alarm came. Nora would later struggle to describe exactly what happened, the way memory sometimes blurs during moments of real fear. She remembered the sudden shift in the air, the way every person in the house seemed to go still at once, heads turning toward the windows like they had heard something no one else could hear. She remembered Cade's hand finding hers, quick and firm, pulling her toward an interior room, away from windows and doors. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent, all the careful gentleness from their weeks together, replaced by something harder, sharper. "Whatever happens, stay here until I come back for you. Cade, please," he said, and something in his eyes, some raw fear she had never seen there before, stopped whatever argument she had been about to make. "I can't do what I need to do out there if I'm worried about you too." She stayed. The room Cade had placed her in was small, windowless, lined with old bookshelves that smelled of dust and cedar. She sat on the floor with her back against a shelf, knees pulled to her chest, listening to sounds she could not place, footsteps moving fast across floors above and below her, low voices that dropped away too quickly to catch, and once, somewhere outside, a sound that raised every hair on her arms, a long, rising howl that was answered a moment later by another, and then another, until it seemed like the whole night around the house was full of voices calling to each other, in a language she did not speak, but somehow understood anyway. It was not a comforting sound. It was the sound of something gathering itself, readying for a fight. She thought of her hospital training, absurdly, in that moment. The way you were taught to stay calm during a crisis, to control your breathing, to keep your hands steady even when your mind wanted to spiral. She used every trick she knew, counting her breaths, pressing her palms flat against the floor to feel something solid and real. It helped, a little, not enough to stop the fear entirely, but enough to keep her from falling apart in that small dark room while people she had come to care about faced danger somewhere beyond the walls. At one point she heard Dee's voice, sharp and commanding, shouting instructions to someone Nora could not see, and felt a small flare of relief simply knowing her friend was close, even in the middle of whatever was happening. Later she would learn that Dee had spent that night helping organize the defense of the house's eastern side, calm and efficient even under pressure. The same sharp-tongued woman who shelled peas on the porch, transformed into someone Nora barely recognized and deeply admired. Time moved strangely in that room. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been 2 hours. She lost track somewhere in the middle of it, focused only on breathing, on waiting, on the small stubborn hope that everyone she had come to care about in this strange new world would walk back through that door in one piece. She would learn later, in pieces, what had happened that night, that a small group from the Hollow had grown bold enough to test the edges of Cade's territory, probing for weakness, perhaps hoping to catch him distracted by his new attachment to a human woman who knew nothing of their world. She would learn that no one was seriously hurt, that Cade and several others had driven the intruders off before things escalated into real violence, that it had mostly been a show of strength on both sides rather than an actual battle. But sitting alone in that dark interior room, listening to sounds she could not identify from somewhere outside, feeling her own heartbeat loud in her ears, Nora understood something she had not fully understood before. This was not a fairy tale. This was Cade's real life, full of real danger, and if she chose to stay in it, that danger would become part of her life too. When Cade finally returned to her, well past 2 in the morning, there was a shallow cut along his forearm that he tried to hide from her, and failed, because she was a nurse, and she noticed these things automatically, without even trying. "You're hurt," she said, already reaching for him. "It's nothing," he said. But he let her examine it anyway, let her clean and bandage it with hands that were not quite steady, though she told herself it was simply exhaustion. "You should have let me help," she said quietly, focused very intently on the bandage rather than his face. "I needed you safe," Cade said. "Everything else comes after that." She looked up at him then, at the exhaustion in his face, the dried blood at his hairline, the way his whole body seemed to sag with relief, now that the danger had passed. And she understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that this was not a decision she needed to think through carefully anymore. She had already made it, somewhere in the past weeks, without fully realizing it. Somewhere between the ditch on Route 9 and this quiet room at 2 in the morning, she had already chosen him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Cade went very still. "Nora, I mean it," she said. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to fall for a secret wolf king with a dangerous rival group and a brother who thinks he's a very large dog. But I'm here, and I'm staying, so you might as well stop trying to protect me from the truth of your life, because I already know it, and I'm choosing it anyway." For a long moment, Cade simply looked at her, something breaking open behind his eyes, something that looked almost like disbelief, mixed with a hope he had been afraid to let himself feel. "You understand what that means," he said quietly. "Truly means. Not just tonight, but for a whole life." "I understand," Nora said. "I've understood for a while now. I was just scared to say it out loud." And now, she reached up and touched the edge of the bandage on his arm, gentle and certain. "Now I'm not scared anymore." The weeks that followed were not easy, not perfectly smooth in the way stories sometimes promise. There were difficult conversations with her own family, who did not know the full truth of what Cade was, only that Nora had fallen for a serious, quiet man with a large extended family and a complicated home life, which was, in its own way, true enough. There was the ongoing tension with the Hollow, which did not simply vanish because Nora had made her choice, but which Cade's community handled with growing confidence and unity, strengthened rather than weakened by the bond between their leader and the woman who had saved his brother's life. There was Finn, fully healed now, who took to referring to Nora as Pack, a term she did not fully understand the weight of until Dee explained it to her one afternoon, with unusual seriousness. "It's not a small thing," Dee said. "Pack isn't just a word for us. It means you belong. It means every single person here would put themselves between you and danger without a second thought, the same way they would for any of us. Finn doesn't say it to just anyone." Nora had not known what to say to that, so she had simply gone and found Finn where he lay stretched out in a patch of afternoon sun, and sat down beside him, resting her hand against his side the way she used to when he was healing in her garage. He had thumped his tail against the ground, content and unbothered, exactly the way he always was around her. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always does after a long winter, and with it came a change Nora had not entirely expected, though perhaps she should have. Cade asked her to marry him on an ordinary Tuesday, of all days, in the same garage where she had once spent 3 sleepless nights keeping his brother alive. He had not planned it that way, he told her later, laughing at himself. He had simply meant to ask her that evening over dinner, somewhere nice, with the kind of careful planning a man in his position was expected to bring to such things. But he had come to pick her up early, and found her in the garage, elbow deep in bandages, tending to a stray cat someone had left at her door that morning, and something about the sight of her there, doing exactly what she always did, had made the words come out of him before he could stop them. "Marry me," he said, standing in the doorway, sounding faintly startled by his own voice. Nora had looked up from the cat, hands still covered in antiseptic, hair falling loose from its tie, and had laughed, the sound bright and surprised in the quiet garage. "Right now? Like this?" "I had a whole plan," Cade admitted, running a hand through his hair. "A restaurant, a ring hidden in dessert, something with candles." "This is better," Nora said, setting down her supplies and crossing the garage to him, the stray cat forgotten for the moment, watching them both with wide, unbothered eyes. "This is exactly where it started. It should be exactly where it keeps going." He had gotten down on one knee right there, on the old concrete floor still faintly stained from that first impossible night, and asked her properly, and she had said yes before he even finished the question, which made them both laugh so hard that the startled cat leapt from the table and hid under the old armchair for the rest of the afternoon. The wedding itself was small, held in the clearing behind Cade's family home, under trees that had stood there longer than anyone could say for certain. Nora's parents came, wide-eyed and a little overwhelmed by the size and strangeness of Cade's extended family, though they warmed quickly once Finn made it his personal mission to charm them both, following Nora's father around the whole reception with the devoted attention of an oversized dog hoping for scraps. Dee stood beside Nora during the ceremony, sharp-tongued as ever, though her eyes were suspiciously bright the whole time. The entire community turned out, filling the clearing with warmth and noise and the kind of open, easy joy that Nora had not fully believed people were capable of sharing with a stranger who had, not so very long ago, been exactly that. Somewhere in the middle of the celebration, Fen came to find her, nudging his head against her hand the way he always did, and pressed something small and cool into her palm with his teeth, gentle as ever. It was a smooth gray stone, polished by years in some riverbed, with a single word carved into its surface in a language she still could not read. "What does it mean?" she asked Cade later, showing him the stone. He turned it over in his fingers, something soft crossing his face. "It's the word my father carved for my mother, on the day they married. It means, roughly, the one who stayed." "Fen gave it to me?" "Fen kept it," Cade corrected gently, "since our mother passed. He must have decided it was time to pass it on." Nora held the stone tightly in her hand for the rest of that evening, and for a long time after, kept it on the small shelf above her side of the bed, where she could see it each morning when she woke. Life did not become simple after the wedding, and Nora had never expected it to. She kept her job at the hospital, exactly as she had told herself she would, driving into town for her shifts 3 or 4 times a week, coming home each time to a house full of noise and warmth that felt entirely unlike the quiet, careful life she had built for herself before that night on Route 9. There were still difficult nights, still moments of tension with the hollow that never fully resolved into lasting peace, still long evenings when Cade came home carrying the weight of decisions she could see pressing down on his shoulders. But there were far more good nights than bad ones, and she had learned, slowly, that this was simply what a real life looked like. Not a fairy tale without shadows, but something sturdier and more honest than that, built from ordinary days stacked carefully on top of each other. Her parents visited often once the initial shock wore off, and though they never learned the full truth of what Cade's family was, they came to love him and his strange, sprawling household in the easy, uncomplicated way that families sometimes manage, without needing every question answered first. Her mother, in particular, grew close to Dee, and the two of them spent hours on the porch some afternoons, shelling peas and trading stories, while Fen dozed contentedly in a patch of sun nearby, one ear always turned toward the sound of Nora's voice, wherever she happened to be. Her co-workers at the hospital noticed the change in her too, though none of them understood the real reason behind it. The head nurse on her floor, a no-nonsense woman who had trained Nora during her very first year, pulled her aside one afternoon between patients and studied her for a long moment. "You look different," she said. "Lighter, somehow. Whatever you're doing outside these walls, keep doing it." Nora had only smiled and gone back to her charts, unable to explain that the lightness came from a house full of an impossible, wonderful family, from a man who still looked at her every single day like she had done something extraordinary simply by refusing to drive past a hurting creature, and from a large gray wolf who greeted her at the door every evening with the same unwavering joy, no matter how hard her shift had been or how tired she felt walking through it. She thought, sometimes, about telling her colleagues the truth, just to see the look on their faces. She never did. Some things were meant to be kept close, protected, folded carefully into the private parts of a life, rather than spread out for anyone passing by to examine. She had learned that from Cade, from his family, from an entire community that had survived for generations by knowing exactly what to share and what to guard. But every night, driving home along that same stretch of Route 9, past the very ditch where it had all begun, she felt a small, private happiness settle over her, quiet and certain, the kind that did not need anyone else's understanding to be real. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Nora would think back to that first night, to the sound of her own tires slowing on a dark, empty road, to the strange gold eyes that had watched her from the ditch, as though waiting to see what kind of person she would turn out to be. She still could not fully explain, even to herself, why she had stopped that night, why some quiet, stubborn part of her had refused to simply keep driving the way anyone reasonable would have. But she had stopped learning to question it. Some choices did not need a full explanation. They only needed to be made, and lived, and never regretted. What matters most, in the end, is simply this. On a dark road, on an ordinary night, Nora Vance made a choice that most people would not have made. She stopped her car. She stepped into the unknown, not because she was fearless, but because some quiet, stubborn part of her could not drive past a creature in pain and simply keep going. That choice changed everything. It brought her into a world she never knew existed, introduced her to a family stranger and more wonderful than anything she could have imagined, and led her, eventually, to a love she had never expected to find on a lonely stretch of road at 1 in the morning. She still has the old wool blanket from that night, worn soft now from years of use, kept folded in the back seat of her car, just in case. She still stops when she sees something in a ditch, though it has never again been anything quite so extraordinary as a wounded wolf with gold eyes and a brother who called himself a king. But she has never once regretted stopping that first time. Not for a single moment. Because sometimes, the smallest choices, made in the dark, on an empty road, when no one else is watching and nothing seems to be at stake, turn out to be the choices that change absolutely everything. And sometimes, the broken creature you stop to help turns out to be carrying you toward exactly the life you were always meant to find.